And welcome to this asynchronous recording about reports in connection with Level 1 students who have been asked to do a report. I'm going to take you through some of the key things to consider in report writing and the approach to writing a report and things to think about so that you've got the best chance of getting a good mark. So let's start off by trying to define what a report is. A report is, I'm literally reading the slide here, but reports are a highly structured form of writing, often following conventions that have been laid down to produce a common format. And that is it in a nutshell. So you've got to remember that we have the expectation of you following that structured format. That there are things within your report that are the same in any other report. And I'm going to talk through those. The first two things I can say about a report are one, that it's factual and it's giving information. It's very much the purpose of a report to do something. It's in answer to something. So you're producing to answer a question or a given task. And the second thing is that although it is a report, it has similarities to other academic writing. So it's got to be objective, as is you're not trying to paint a picture that's inaccurate. You're not trying to put one thing above another. You're being objective and handling the arguments or whatever you're saying in a balanced way. You're not trying to prove your own point, but you're trying to prove the points of what would actually be best in the given situation. And although it's a report, your writing style is still going to be formal. You are still going to be using language which is academic but accessible. You're going to not be using slang words. You're not going to be casual or conversational, or use I, the first person. These kind of things remain similar to academic writing. And of course, we are expecting to see references throughout, cited in the report and with a reference list up the back. So it has to be rigorous. Every time you are making a point, making a claim, justifying something, we're hoping that you can provide evidence to support the reason that you've made that claim or that justification. Some of the other tips I can give you about a report are that it should be well presented. So, you're going to have a cover page, it's going to have certain formatting that's involved, but I also mentioned here it shouldn't be excessive. So you don't want to spend hours on working out how you're going to present, hours on the font you choose or the way you lay out the cover. You should give it some thought and it should be interesting, but I wouldn't be spending too much time. Because the thing that's really going to bring home the marks, if you're that way inclined, if that's the way you think, you've got to have evidence of analytical thinking in there. And what we mean by that is justification, showing your working. So when you make a decision, you say we should do this as a company, we should do that as a company, this company should adopt this strategy. Then you're showing us that you've thought about why you should do that and you're justifying it. So analytical thinking, looking at all the possibilities and then picking the best one, but giving reasons for it. That's kind of analytical thinking. That you're going to have, or you may have, recommendations. And for me, when you're making recommendations, it's a to-do list for the person that gets the report. An example of that would be, say you discover that a building is a fire hazard for some reason, then you're going to recommend they get a sprinkler system. So it's what do they have to do to fix it? A to-do list. What do they have to do to change things around? So that's what makes a recommendation. Just be aware of that. You don't need to discuss what it's fixing. You just have to say this is what you have to do. There are generally three purposes that a report can have. And you should work that out because that's important, because that kind of helps you understand what you're trying to do. So one is collecting data and presenting the findings. The third one is to review and evaluate the literature on a topic and identify any issues that are within it. Or the one that you're doing, and probably the one that is most common, to analyse a situation or an activity. So in this case, you're analysing a company's marketing strategy. And you're trying to say, how can we improve this? How can we develop this? How can we make this better for the future? And that's what you're doing. So you're analysing a situation or activity. A situation in this case, how well is this company performing its marketing? When it comes to what am I actually going to put in this report, there are some useful things that can help you to do that. One of the first things I would advise you to do is think about the learning outcomes of the module. The learning outcomes of the module are in the module handbook. Another useful thing you can do when you're trying to do a report is to imagine yourself as the person who's getting the report, not the person writing it, but the person who's getting it. So you imagine that you are the person who's asked for input to improve their marketing. You've looked for input to improve on how they do things. Then you can say, well, what would I expect from that? What kind of questions do I want answered? And that way you can kind of, it's not easy to do, but if you can put yourself in their shoes, then you can it helps you better evaluate the report once it's finished, and you can say, does this report do what it says it's going to do, and tell me what I have to do, and explain why, with evidence, why I should make these decisions or do these things. And that's really important. Does it doing what it says? And sometimes when you sit down with your own report and say, I'm the manager of this company, how helpful has this been? That can maybe help you elucidate the strengths of your report and where you've done well, and maybe highlight areas that you can improve within it. The other thing, of course, is to make sure that the research and writing is all relevant. For example, if you're doing a PESTLE or a PEST, let's just keep it to PEST. So you've got political, economic, social and technological factors that can affect a company's performance, or have an effect on what the company does, or help you understand what the company should do in the future to react to these factors. So you have to make sure that when you bring up a social factor, that is related to what the company does, and it's a factor that will actually affect it. That is something socially relevant. Again, if we're talking about politics or something political, there's no point in talking about some political action or thing that's happening with the government if it doesn't affect your company, if it doesn't have an impact on your company. So make sure when you're looking for the factors in a PEST analysis that all those PEST factors have something to say in connection with what your company's trying to do and how it's trying to do it, that allow you to negotiate those factors, to make the best of those factors. So another really important thing, because of word count, etc., is a report has a scope, and the scope of a report is what you should write about, and it says this is what we're talking about and this is what we're not talking about. So it's what should be included and what should be excluded. And it's very important to understand from what you've been asked to do what is relevant and what is not relevant. So you start to highlight things that you've been asked to do, so you pay close attention to guidelines. And I think that you've been given quite substantial guidelines. So if we look at this slide, it's very much cut up or cropped or lifted out the real key points that you've been asked to do in this report. So the overall thing here is to discuss the current position of the company. That's it. That's the overview. That's the scope. Discuss. Now, how do you do this? Well, very kindly they've said by providing a description of the company's current market position, the company structure, and the company profile. And each of those things will be things that you have dealt with or been taught about or sought explanation for during the module. So you know that there's things related to these that you'll need to discuss. That part and this part are where your analytical skills are tested. When they said, what are the key developments in the wider fashion market which you will understand via a PEST analysis? So you'll be able to say this is what's going on politically, economically, socially, technologically. This is what's going on in the wider fashion market. You know, perhaps we're talking about sustainability. Perhaps we're talking about the environment. These are things that we've got to look to. These are things that we accommodate. And therefore, you can then compare what you get in your PEST with what you found out and say, when we look at the company market position and the company structure and profile, where does sustainability fit in with that? If that were the case, I'm not saying it's sustainability, I'm not saying it's not sustainability, but just for means of an example. And then finally, using the marketing mix, how do we understand where the company is, what's happening in the world, and perhaps how the marketing mix can change and be applied to the company to make things better. So, if I was to put it simply, I would say, where is the company now? What kind of things should the company take a note of that are happening? And then how can you use the marketing mix to say this is where the company should be or the direction it should go? That's the kind of thing that we'd be looking for you to do. So as I say, using those guidelines, they're telling you what you should do. All right, I want to move on to the structure now. Every report has at least, I would say, at least those items in it. It has a title page, it has a contents page, then it has an introduction, it has a main body with the findings, and then it'll have a conclusion and it'll have a reference page. That's your minimum for a report structure. This is where the first point comes from when I said highly structured. Okay. The contents page is very important because it helps you navigate a report. Also, in a report, it has headings that clearly show you what's going on in each section. So when you give a section a heading, make sure that the heading describes what's going on in the paragraph. So sometimes you will make a heading and then you'll write the section. What I would say is double check that heading does the job, because the more accurate your heading, the better, the easier it is to navigate your report. And the headings are the thing that goes in the contents page, as I mentioned before. So if you have headings that are relevant and explain what's on in each section, your report will be easy to navigate And that's one of the purposes of a report. I could pick up a report and I'm only interested in one thing, one section, one part of it. So I go to the contents page, I look for that section, I find the page number and I go and read it. If your sections are vague, the headings are vague or don't explain what's going on, I'm not going to find what I'm looking for, and that defeats the purpose of a contents page. Make the information easy to find. I would argue that there can be places where you can use bullet points perhaps rather than full sentences because you're trying to bring clarity. Therefore, shorter, more concise paragraphs and the use of bullet points can help improve the impact of your report. Because if you think about it, as I said before, it's information given. You have somebody reading this, trying to understand what you want them to do to improve things. So it's got to be accessible for them. It's got to be in a way that they can understand, that has clarity, that's accessible. And that's not an easy thing to do in a report. And if you get that balance right, then your report will get, you'll get a good mark for that if that's what you're interested in. The other thing that can be really useful is some sort of graphics. So perhaps some tables, some graphs to support the points you're making. Graphs, figures are really useful again for clarity, for ease of getting a point across. A picture is worth 1,000 words. Although try handing in 3 pictures instead of a 3,000 word essay and see how far you get. So, I don't know how true it is, but I agree that graphics and tables can really clearly state a point or support the main points that you're making in the written text. They don't replace the text, but they are a very useful addition to the text. Also, you may have appendices. They may allow you to use appendices where if you have a large amount of complex material, you can't put that in the text. There's a limit to what's expected to be in the text. Anything bigger that you think is relevant, you would put in an appendix and you would refer to it. Again, things in appendices help you support the points you're trying to make, and you would refer to them, you would summarise them, or make reference to them in the text and then say, see appendix. I am aware that you do need an executive summary for this report. I just want to roughly run through what's included. So the first thing you have to write in an executive summary, although the whole summary would be one paragraph of possibly between 200 and 400 words, you've got to say why. What is the purpose of your report? Okay, why have you done the report? What are you doing the investigation on? What is the scope or breadth of the investigation? What's involved in it? How are you conducting this? So I can say, for example, part of what you're doing is a pest analysis. But if you're using any other analytical tools, you would mention them as well. Then you'll point out what you've actually found out, the major findings, key statistics, whatever that may be. You highlight those. And then, so what does this mean? Do you have any conclusions? And you do, and recommendations to make for the direction the company should go in. So why, what, how, what you found out, so what. These are the 5 things that should be in your executive summary. What makes a good report? A functional, effective report is going to be clear about how you reach decisions you've made. So you're going to show you're working. So you don't just say this company should do this and this and this, but you should say this company should do this because of what we found in the pest, because of the social factors of the pest analysis, because of the theory that's involved, of good market position or segmentation or whatever it may be. Show you're working, show how you got to where you are. In part, that's very important because it backs up what you say. Then we can give you credit for the way you've gone about it. If you show you're working, we can give you credit for what you've done. If you don't show you're working, if you don't tell us how you ride it, it might be the right answers, it might be the correct things to do, but we can't give you any extra marks for it. Because you're working in a group and there's 4 or 5 of you, then this part is really important, that you make sure everything links and makes sense. Don't have loose ends. I think that is really important. So what do I mean by no loose ends? Make sure that if something is talked about in the introduction, or something is talked about in the past, that then it is followed through and makes its way through to a possible recommendation or something to be considered in the marketing mix. The problems when you don't link up is you mention something that seems to be important and then it kind of disappears and it's not considered later on in the report. So the people, you have to talk to each other and look at each other's work to make sure that everything links up and there's a chain that carries everything through, so that all your recommendations lead back to something that you've alluded to in the report, and everything that you've discovered or is important comes forward and is dealt with when it comes to decisions about what the company should do. This is a really difficult thing to do, but it's really important. You've got a word count, and that makes it important that you don't waste words, so you don't be overly wordy. And to do that, then what you have to do is get this balance between being understood but being concise. So making your points with the least amount of words possible. And I think I sum it up reasonably well by saying being able to write just enough to make your point in a clear and understandable way. There is no need for anything after this. When you think of an essay where you have perhaps more word count, or the questions asking you to go into more detail or to explain more, that's not really a luxury you have in a report. A report is very much the function of doing what it's asked to do. And when you can be concise but understood, you're being very effective with your word count, and that does allow you to say more. Because word count can be at a premium in a report. That's the way reports have to be. They have to be this concise document that doesn't ramble, that doesn't go off in tangents, that's very much to the point. There is some descriptive parts to your report, but it has limited when it comes to things like analysis. Analysis should be far more prevalent than description. You have to say what you're talking about. So you have to talk about what is a marketing mix. You have to talk about certain concepts and mention this is what it is. But this is going to be very brief, but you're going to be more important about what you're going to do with it, how it's going to function, what's going to happen. So that makes it much more about the why than the what. Why have you made, not what your decision is, why have you made that decision? And keep that balance. The analysis of how you came to your decisions, why you're doing things is much more relevant, and the description has a limited function of setting things up, introducing the concept that you're going to analyse. So finally, this is a question to apply to what you've written. Does what I'm writing help me answer the question? And once you have your report, once it's all done, you should be able to go back to the guidelines that you were given and say, I've done this, I've done this, I've done this, I've done this. There's no harm in going back to that first page you got and looking at it and say, right, I was to discuss the current position, so how do I do that? Like I've given a description of the company's current market position. I've said the things that are involved with that. I've detailed the company structure, and I've detailed the company profile by doing this, that, and the next thing. I've done the structure by all of these. Then I've done my pest analysis. Yeah, I've done a pest analysis, and I've got the key developments, the political developments, the economic developments, the social developments, and the technological developments that are relevant to the fashion market. Right, and then what I've done is, I've got evidence that I've brought this in to the marketing mix and showing how the company can make more of its marketing, etc., to do better, to change, to move on, to keep up. So just to recap, what is rewarded in report writing? If you can bring in references to back up what you're saying for the decisions you make, if you have a choice and you bring in a couple of journal articles that support your choice or this decision or say why that's the thing you should do, wider reading will be rewarded because they understand, because people understand, academics understand that it takes time to read, to take things in, and then to apply it to your work, and they will reward you for that, for taking that time. If you have a comprehensive analysis that you fully justify all the decisions you're taking, when we understand why you're doing things as much as what you're doing, they will reward that because it does take real effort to get that analysis, to consider everything and find that justification. Also, does what you're saying make sense? Is it clear? Is it accessible? Sometimes simplifying or making a message accessible to give it clarity takes a lot of thought, and you will be rewarded for that because you know they've sat and you've considered it and you've just kind of looked at it, thought about it, considered it, cogitated on it, and come up with what you've come up with. Finally, if you hand in a report that has no loose ends, that fully answers everything that you've been asked to do, that has no typos, where the section headings represent the sections, then you will be rewarded for that because it takes patience not to give up and say, oh, I've done enough for this, I'm submitting it. You know, I think we can all be in that. I absolutely remember being in that place. But if you've got time and you use every second you have and try to eliminate simple typos and address everything so that the whole report looks and reads well, you'll be rewarded for that. So thanks very much for taking the time to listen to my presentation. I hope it's useful. Importantly, I'll be doing 4 question and answer sessions for each of the seminar classes. So if you take on board what I've said, you started to look at it, you've got questions you want to ask, I'll be there for an hour at each of these classes online. A link will be available, and I'll be very happy to discuss any questions you have. So thanks very much for watching this, and perhaps I'll see you again at the Q&A next week. Thanks very much.